Hello, welcome back to my channel. Today we are talking about history of Michigan from ancient times to the modern era. Michigan's story begins over 3.5 billion years ago, when the ancient bedrock that forms the foundation of the Upper Peninsula was first formed during the Archean Eon. These ancient rocks, among the oldest on Earth, would later provide the mineral wealth that drove much of Michigan's economic development. The most dramatic chapter in Michigan's geological prehistory came during the Pleistocene Epoch, beginning roughly 2.6 million years ago. During this period, massive continental glaciers advanced and retreated across the region multiple times, fundamentally reshaping the landscape. The most recent glacial advance, known as the Wisconsin Glaciation, reached its maximum extent. Approximately two of these ice sheets, some over a mile thick, carved out the basins that would become the Great Lakes, deposited vast quantities of sand, gravel, and clay across the region, and created the distinctive topography that characterizes Michigan today. As the glaciers retreated between 14,000 and 10,000 years ago, they left behind a dramatically altered landscape. The weight of the ice had depressed the land, and as it melted, vast quantities of water were released, creating enormous glacial lakes that were predecessors to the modern Great Lakes. Lake Algonquin, for instance, was a massive prehistoric lake that covered much of what is now Lakes Huron and Michigan, extending far beyond their current boundaries. The retreating ice revealed a land of extraordinary diversity. The Upper Peninsula emerged as a rugged, mineral-rich region dominated by ancient granite and iron formations. The Lower Peninsula, by contrast, was characterized by gently rolling hills, fertile plains, and extensive wetlands. Vast forests began to colonize the newly exposed land, with different species adapting to the various soil types and climatic conditions created by the glacial activity. The post-glacial environment was dominated by boreal forests of spruce and fir, gradually giving way to mixed forests of pine, oak, maple, and other hardwoods as the climate warmed. These forests provided habitat for a remarkable array of wildlife, including mastodons, giant beavers, caribou, and eventually the more familiar species like white-tailed deer, elk, black bears, and wolves that would characterize the region when humans first arrived. This geological legacy would prove crucial to Michigan's human history. The fertile soils deposited by the glaciers would support agriculture, the vast forests would provide timber for a booming lumber industry, and the mineral deposits exposed by glacial action would fuel mining operations. The Great Lakes themselves would become highways for transportation and commerce, while also providing abundant fresh water and supporting rich fisheries. First Peoples, Native American civilization. These earliest inhabitants were Paleo-Indians, nomadic hunters who followed large game animals across the newly exposed landscape. Archaeological evidence of their presence has been found throughout Michigan, with some of the most significant sites located near former shorelines of ancient glacial lakes. The Paleo-Indians were sophisticated hunters who developed specialized tools and weapons, including the distinctive fluted spear points that are their archaeological signature. They hunted mastodons, giant beavers, caribou, and other megafauna that characterized the post-glacial environment. As the climate continued to warm and the large Ice Age animals became extinct, these early peoples adapted their hunting strategies and began to exploit a wider range of resources. The Archaic period, beginning around 8000 BCE, saw significant cultural and technological developments among Michigan's indigenous peoples. The population grew and became more settled, with people beginning to establish seasonal camps and developing more sophisticated tool technologies. They learned to exploit the rich resources of the emerging Great Lakes ecosystem, developing techniques for fishing and gathering aquatic plants. The Atlat, or spear throw was perfected during this period, greatly improving hunting efficiency. Archaeological sites from the Archaic period reveal increasingly complex societies. The people developed trade networks that extended across much of eastern North America, exchanging copper from Michigan's Upper Peninsula for materials like marine shells from the Gulf Coast and exotic stones from distant regions. This early copper mining and working represents one of the world's oldest known metal industries, with evidence of copper extraction from Isle Royale and the Quinault Peninsula dating back over. The Woodland period, beginning around 1000 BCE, brought revolutionary changes to Michigan's indigenous culture. The introduction of pottery allowed for better food storage and cooking, while the development of agriculture, particularly the cultivation of corn, beans and squash, known as the Three Sisters, provided more reliable food sources and supported larger, more permanent settlement. The Middle Woodland period, 100 BCE to 400 CE, was dominated by the Hopewell culture, one of the most sophisticated prehistoric civilizations in North America. The Hopewell people built elaborate earthworks and burial mounds throughout Ohio and extending into southern Michigan. They developed extensive trade networks, sophisticated agricultural systems, and complex social and religious institutions. Michigan's Hopewell sites, while not as extensive as those in Ohio, reveal a people who had mastered sophisticated techniques of earthwork construction and who participated in continent-wide trade networks. They worked copper into elaborate ornaments and tools, created fine pottery, and developed complex burial practices that suggest belief systems focused on death and the afterlife. By 1000 CE, the stage was set for the emergence of the complex Native American societies that would characterize Michigan at the time of European contact. The Mississippian period, 1000–1600 CE, brought the final major cultural transformation before European contact. While the classic Mississippian culture was centered in the southeastern United States, its influence extended into southern Michigan. By the time European explorers first entered the Great Lakes region in the early 17th century, Michigan was home to several distinct Native American groups, each with their own territories, languages, and cultural practices. The most prominent groups included the Ojibwe, Chippewa, Ottawa, Odawa, and Potawatomi, who formed the Council of Three Fires Alliance. These groups, collectively known as the Anishinaabe, shared similar languages and cultural traditions, but maintained distinct identities and territory. The Ojibwe were the largest group, primarily occupying the northern regions of Michigan, including much of the Upper Peninsula and northern Lower Peninsula. They were skilled hunters, fishers, and gatherers who had developed sophisticated knowledge of the region's seasonal patterns and natural resources. The Ojibwe were also skilled at harvesting wild rice, which grew abundantly in the region's wetlands and became a crucial food source. The Ottawa primarily inhabited the western Lower Peninsula and had developed particularly strong trading networks. They served as intermediaries in trade between other Native American groups, and would later play similar roles in European trade networks. The Ottawa were skilled at both inland and Great Lakes travel, using birch bark canoes to navigate the region's extensive waterway systems. The Potawatomi occupied much of southern Michigan and had developed sophisticated agricultural systems. They grew corn, beans, squash, and other crops, while also maintaining their hunting and gathering traditions. The Potawatomi had established numerous permanent villages throughout their territory, and had developed complex social and political organization. These indigenous peoples of Michigan had developed sophisticated knowledge of their environment, including detailed understanding of seasonal patterns, animal behavior, plant resources, and geographical features. They had created complex social and political systems, extensive trade networks, and rich cultural traditions including oral histories, religious practices, and artistic expressions. The societies were not static or isolated. They were dynamic, adaptable cultures that had successfully managed the resources of the Great Lakes region for millennia. They had developed sustainable practices for hunting, fishing, gathering, and agriculture that allowed them to thrive in the region's diverse environments without depleting natural resources. European arrival, exploration, and early contact. The first Europeans to reach Michigan were French explorers and traders who arrived in the early 17th century as part of France's broader exploration and colonization efforts in North America. These early encounters between Europeans and Native Americans would set the stage for centuries of cultural interaction, conflict, and change that would fundamentally transform both societies. The French exploration of the Great Lakes region was driven by several factors: the search for a northwest passage to Asia, the desire to spread Christianity among indigenous peoples, and the pursuit of economic opportunities, particularly in the fur trade. Unlike other European colonizing powers, the French approach to colonization emphasized trade relationships and alliances with Native American peoples, rather than large-scale settlement and displacement. The first European known to have reached Michigan was probably Étienne Brulé, who explored the region around 1615–1620 as part of Samuel de Champlain's broader exploration of New France. Brulé traveled through the Upper Peninsula and may have been the first European to see Lake Superior. However, he left no written records of his journeys, and much of what we know about his travels comes from later sources. More definitively documented was the journey of Jean Nicolet in 1634, who traveled through the Straits of Mackinac while searching for a water route to the Pacific Ocean. Nicolet's voyage, sponsored by Champlain, was primarily focused on establishing trade relationships with indigenous peoples and gathering information about the geography of the region. The most significant early French exploration of Michigan came with the journeys of Father Jacques Marquette and Louis Joliet. Marquette, a Jesuit missionary, established a mission at Sault-Ste-Marie in 1668, creating the first permanent European settlement in Michigan. This mission, located at the rapids connecting Lake Superior and Huron, was strategically positioned to serve both as a center for missionary activities and as a key point in the developing fur trade network. Marquette's mission work brought him into close contact with the Ojibwe people, who dominated the region around Sault-Ste-Marie. Unlike many European colonizers, Marquette made serious efforts to learn Native American languages and understand indigenous culture. His writings provide some of the earliest detailed European observations of Native American life in the Great Lakes region. Another crucial figure in early French exploration was René Robert Cavelier, Sieur de La Salle, who traveled through Michigan in the 1670s and 1680s as part of his efforts to establish French control over the interior of North America. La Salle recognized the strategic importance of the Great Lakes region and worked to establish a network of forts and trading posts that would secure French interests. In 1679, La Salle built and launched the Griffin, the first full-size sailing ship to navigate the upper Great Lakes. The Griffin sailed from Lake Erie, through Lake Huron, and on to Lake Michigan, demonstrating the potential for large-scale transportation and commerce on the Great Lakes. Although the Griffin was lost on its return voyage, its successful initial journey proved the feasibility of using the Great Lakes as a transportation network. The early French explorers were followed by traders, missionaries, and eventually military personnel who established a French presence throughout the Great Lakes region. The French approach to colonization was based on what historians call the middle ground, a space of cultural accommodation and mutual adaptation between Europeans and Native Americans. This middle ground was particularly evident in the fur trade, which became the foundation of the early colonial economy in Michigan. The fur trade required close cooperation between French traders and Native American hunters and trappers. Native Americans provided not only furs, but also essential knowledge of the land, waterways, and seasonal patterns that made successful trading possible. French traders, known as coureurs de bois, runners of the woods, lived among Native American communities, learned indigenous languages, and often married Native American women. These marriages created important kinship networks that facilitated trade relationships and helped maintain peace between French and Native American communities. The Jesuit missionaries, who accompanied the traders, played a crucial role in French colonization efforts. While their primary goal was religious conversion, they also served as diplomats, teachers, and recorders of Native American culture. Jesuit Relations, the annual reports sent back to France by missionary societies, provide invaluable historical records of early contact between Europeans and Native Americans in Michigan. However, the arrival of Europeans also brought significant challenges and disruptions to Native American communities. European diseases, to which Native Americans had no immunity, caused devastating epidemics that dramatically reduced indigenous population. Smallpox, measles, typhus, and other diseases spread rapidly through Native American communities, sometimes killing half or more of a community's population. The fur trade, while providing new opportunities and technologies, also altered traditional Native American economic and social patterns. The demand for beaver pelts and other furs led to intensified hunting that eventually depleted animal populations in some areas. Competition for fur-bearing territories contributed to conflicts between different Native American groups. European goods, metal tools, firearms, cloth, alcohol became increasingly important to Native American communities, creating dependencies on European trade. While these goods often improved daily life and provided advantages in hunting and warfare, they also made Native American communities more vulnerable to disruptions in trade relations. Despite these challenges, many Native American communities successfully adapted to the new realities brought by European contact. They became skilled negotiators and diplomats, playing European powers against each other to maintain their independence and secure favorable terms in trade relations. The French colonial era. The establishment of French colonial rule in Michigan began in earnest in the late 17th century and reached its peak in the early to mid-18th century. This period was characterized by the development of a unique colonial society that blended French, Native American, and eventually other European cultural elements into a distinctive Great Lakes culture. The most important French settlement in Michigan was Detroit, founded by Antoine de la Mothe Cadillac in Cadillac chose the site strategically, locating his Fort Pontchartrain du Détroit, at the narrowest point between Lakes Huron and Erie, where it could control water traffic and serve as a center for both military operations and trade activities. Cadillac's vision for Detroit was ambitious. He hoped to create a major colonial city that would serve as the center of French power in the Great Lakes region. To attract settlers, he offered generous land grants and trading privileges. He also actively recruited Native American communities to settle near the fort, believing that a mixed French Native American community would be more stable and prosperous than a purely European settlement. The early years of Detroit were challenging. The settlement faced constant threats from hostile Native American groups, suffered from inadequate supplies and support from France, and struggled with internal conflicts between different factions of settlers. However, by the 1720s, Detroit had become a thriving community, with a population of several hundred French settlers and a much larger population of allied Native Americans living in nearby villages. Detroit's economy was based primarily on the fur trade, but the settlement also developed agriculture, with French farmers clearing land along the Detroit River and establishing the distinctive ribbon farms, long, narrow plots that extended back from the river. This agricultural system, which originated in the St. Lawrence River Valley, was well suited to the geography of southeastern Michigan and provided the food necessary to support the growing settlement. The society that developed in Detroit and other French settlements in Michigan was distinctly multicultural. French traders, missionaries, and officials worked closely with Native American communities, and intermarriage between French men and Native American women was common and socially acceptable. These marriages created important kinship networks that helped maintain peace and facilitate trade. The children of these mixed marriages, known as métis, played crucial roles in French colonial society. They often served as interpreters, traders, and diplomatic intermediaries between French and Native American communities. Many became prominent leaders in their own right, combining knowledge of both French and Native American cultures to navigate the complex social and political landscape of colonial Michigan. French military and administrative control in Michigan was centered at several key locations. In addition to Detroit, the French maintained important posts at Sault Ste. Marie, Michilimackinac, on the straits between Lakes Huron and Michigan, and Fort St. Joseph, near present-day Nye. These posts served multiple functions. They were military bases that could project French power throughout the region, trading centers that facilitated commerce between French merchants and Native American trappers, and administrative centers that represented French authority. The Catholic Church played a central role in French colonial society. In Michigan, Jesuit missionaries continued their work among Native American communities, while secular priests served the spiritual needs of French settlers. The church provided not only religious services, but also education, medical care, and social services. Churches and missions served as community centers, where French and Native American peoples came together for religious ceremonies, social gatherings, and important announcements. The fur trade remained the foundation of Michigan's colonial economy throughout the French period. The trade was organized around a licensing system controlled by the colonial government. Traders had to obtain licenses, congés, to operate in specific territories, and the government collected taxes and fees that provided important revenue for colonial administration. The French colonial period in Michigan was also marked by ongoing conflicts with other European powers, particularly Britain. The rivalry between France and Britain for control of North America led to a series of wars that affected Michigan throughout the colonial period. King William's War, 1689–1697, Queen Anne's War, 17. The French worked hard to maintain alliances with Native American groups throughout these conflicts, recognizing that indigenous allies were essential for defending their scattered and vulnerable settlements. French diplomats and military officers spent considerable time and resources on maintaining these alliances, providing gifts, arms, and other support to ensure Native American loyalty. The French colonial period also saw significant cultural developments that would have lasting impacts on Michigan. The interaction between French and Native American cultures produced new forms of music, art, cuisine, and social practices. French colonists adapted to Native American techniques for surviving in the wilderness, while Native Americans incorporated European technologies and ideas into their own cultural practices. By the 1750s, French colonial society in Michigan had developed its own distinctive characteristics. It was a society that successfully integrated French, Native American, and Métis populations into a functioning colonial system. It was based on trade rather than agriculture, on cooperation with Native Americans rather than their displacement, and on cultural accommodation rather than rigid European dominance. However, this society was also vulnerable to external pressure. The ongoing wars with Britain, the declining profits of the fur trade, and France's growing focus on other colonial territories all threatened the stability of French rule in Michigan. British rule and the Revolutionary War. The French and Indian War 1754–1763 marked the beginning of the end of French colonial rule in North America and ushered in a new era of British dominance in Michigan. The transition from French to British rule would prove to be a traumatic and transformative period that fundamentally altered the political, economic, and social structures of Great Lakes society. The war began over competing French and British claims to the Ohio River Valley, but it quickly expanded to encompass much of North America. In the Great Lakes region, the conflict involved not only French and British regular forces, but also various Native American allies, fighting on both sides. The turning point came in 1759–1760, when British forces captured Quebec and Montreal, effectively ending French resistance in Canada. In 1760, British forces under Major Robert Rogers took control of Detroit without a fight, as the French commandant, recognizing the hopelessness of his position, surrendered the post peacefully. The Treaty of Paris, signed in 1763, formally ended French rule in North America. France ceded all of its North American territories east of the Mississippi River to Britain, while Spain ceded Florida to Britain in exchange for receiving Louisiana from France. For the residents of Michigan, the transition to British rule was disorienting and often traumatic. The French colonial system had been based on accommodation and cooperation between Europeans and Native Americans. The British, by contrast, brought different attitudes and policies that often alienated indigenous peoples and disrupted established relationships. British officials viewed Native Americans as conquered peoples who should be grateful for British protection, rather than as allies who deserved respect and consultation. They ended the French practice of providing regular gifts to Native American leaders, viewing such payments as tribute that they should not have to pay to their own subjects. These policy changes, combined with British settlers increasing pressure on Native American lands, led to growing tensions throughout the Great Lakes region. The tensions exploded in 1763, with Pontiac's Rebellion, one of the most significant Native American uprisings in North American history. Pontiac, an Ottawa war chief, organized a confederation of tribes throughout the Great Lakes region in an attempt to drive the British out and restore the French colonial system. The rebellion began with coordinated attacks on British forts throughout the Great Lakes region. Detroit came under siege in May 1763, with Pontiac's forces surrounding the fort and maintaining the siege for several months. Other British posts were less fortunate. Fort Michilimackinac fell to a surprise attack during a lacrosse game when Ojibwe and Sauk warriors used the game as a distraction to gain entry to the fort. Most of the British garrison was killed, though some French residents were spared, reflecting the rebels' specific hostility to British rule rather than to all Europeans. The rebellion lasted for several years, and demonstrated both the strength of Native American resistance and the challenges facing British rule in the Great Lakes region. Although the British eventually suppressed the uprising, it forced them to reconsider their policies toward Native America. In response to Pontiac's rebellion, the British government issued the Proclamation of 1763, which prohibited colonial settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains, and reserved these territories for Native Americans. While this policy was intended to prevent conflicts between settlers and Native Americans, it was widely resented by American colonists, who saw it as an infringement on their rights and opportunities. During the 1760s and 70s, British rule in Michigan gradually stabilized. The British retained the basic structure of the fur trade while modifying some of its practices. British merchants replaced French traders in many cases, though they often had to rely on French voyageurs and Métis intermediaries, who had the skills and knowledge necessary for successful wilderness trading. The outbreak of the American Revolution in 1775 created new challenges for British rule in Michigan. The British used their Michigan posts as bases for operations against American settlements on the frontier. They provided arms and supplies to Native American allies, who raided American settlements in Kentucky, Pennsylvania, and other frontier regions. The British strategy was based on the assumption that their Native American allies could tie down American forces on the frontier and prevent them from concentrating against British armies in the east. This strategy had some success, as American forces were indeed forced to divert resources to frontier defense. Several significant military operations during the Revolutionary War directly affected Michigan. In 1778, George Rogers Clark's expedition captured British posts in present-day Illinois and Indiana, threatening British control of the entire Great Lakes region. Although Clark's forces never reached Michigan, his successes demonstrated the vulnerability of British positions in the West. The Revolution also had significant impacts on the civilian population of Michigan. French settlers found themselves in a difficult position, as they were now British subjects fighting against Americans who claimed to represent liberty and republican values. Some French settlers supported the British, viewing them as preferable to American rule, while others sympathized with the American cause. Native American communities faced even more difficult choices. Different tribes and even different factions within tribes made different decisions about which side to support. Some groups allied with the British, believing that British rule offered better protection for Native American rights than American rule. Others remained neutral, or even supported the Americans, hoping to secure better treatment from the eventual winners. The end of the Revolutionary War in 1783 brought dramatic changes to Michigan's political situation. The Treaty of Paris that ended the war transferred all British territories south of the Great Lakes to the United States, including Michigan. However, the British were reluctant to give up their profitable Great Lakes posts and found various pretexts for delaying their withdrawal.